The courtroom door opened with a creak that sounded louder than it should have. Every head turned, some with curiosity, some with dread. But when Chris Brown stepped in, the atmosphere changed, not shifted, tightened. As if the very air recognized the weight he carried. He wasn't on the list of scheduled witnesses. No camera had caught him walking in. No reporter had predicted this. But there he stood, his posture steady, his face unreadable, his eyes burning with something only a few in that room had seen before truth not yet spoken. The judge paused mid-sentence. The prosecution leaned in, surprised but not confused. Someone had filed an emergency motion. Chris was here for a reason. The bailiff stepped aside. Chris moved forward with the kind of silence that speaks volumes. He took his place at the witness stand, placed one hand on the wooden edge, the other hovering slightly as though it had to ask permission to touch truth. When he spoke, his voice didn't shake. It sliced. "I wasn't going to say anything," he began, "because when you're young and famous, you think silence protects you. You think surviving means playing the game. But I'm not here to play anymore." The room stilled, leaned in as one body. He looked over to the defense table where Diddy sat, still and calculated. His expression didn't flicker, but his jaw tightened, just slightly, and Chris saw it. Recognition, dread. Then Chris turned to the jury. "I met him when I was 17, just a kid from Virginia with a voice and a dream. He said he wanted to mentor me. Said I reminded him of a younger version of himself. And I believed him." He exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for a decade. "At first, it was all love parties, trips, rooms full of legends. I thought I made it. But everything he gives comes with a price." He paused, and the stillness of the room dared someone to cough, to blink, to move. No one did. "There was this party, 2009, private. No cameras, no phones, just Diddy's circle. I was invited. He told me, 'Come celebrate.' So I went. What I saw still follows me. Rooms that weren't about fun, rooms that looked like control, girls who looked scared, men who looked bought, and him, always smiling, watching, like he was testing us, seeing who'd flinch, who'd follow, who'd keep the secrets." Chris gripped the edge of the stand. His knuckles turned white. "And I stayed quiet, because I thought that's just how it worked. You shut up, you stay in the game. If you walk away, they remind you who built your ladder." He turned back to Diddy. "You did that. You used my name, my face, my pain, and you turned it into leverage." For the first time, the defense team shifted. A lawyer scribbled something. A reporter dropped her pen. Chris wasn't here to speculate. He was testifying. "I wasn't perfect. I've had my moments, my mugshots, my meltdowns, and some of y'all judged me for it, and maybe you were right. But what you didn't see was what came before all of that, what pushed me, what poisoned me before I ever had a chance to grow." He turned back to the jury. "You saw the headlines, but you didn't see the grooming, the manipulation, the rooms I couldn't leave, the deals I couldn't say no to, the threats wrapped in praise, the control hidden in mentorship." His eyes locked with one juror, then another. "I know what you're thinking. Why now? Why speak now after all this time? Because I started writing it down, back then. When I realized staying quiet wasn't saving me, it was killing me." He drew in a breath, like each sentence was a wound being reopened. "There was this one house, not the mansion, not the one in the magazines, a different one, no cameras, no labels, just silence and mirrors. There was a room with padded walls, bottles, music playing on loop, and girls, always girls, told to smile, to keep him happy. He clenched his teeth. One night, a girl broke. She cried, said she wanted to leave. One of his guys handed her something, pills, I think, and said, "Take this or be replaced." He stopped, closed his eyes. She took it. The judge didn't say a word. No objection from the defense. No one dared interrupt. This was no longer testimony. This was confession and indictment fused. I didn't stop it. I didn't help her. I froze, because I wasn't afraid of her breaking down. I was afraid of him, of what would happen if I stepped out of line. He looked back at Diddy. And that's what power looks like when it rots. It doesn't need to yell. It just needs to own your silence. Chris straightened. His voice steadied. You called it mentorship. I call it manipulation. The courtroom had transformed. No longer a neutral space, it had become a reckoning ground. You dangled fame like a prize, then turned it into a collar. And every time I tried to breathe, you tightened it. The silence in the room had weight now, as if the very air remembered every name that never made it to a witness stand. But what you didn't know, Chris said, was that I started documenting. Every call, every message, every retreat invitation where phones weren't allowed, I saved them. Not because I planned to go public, but because I knew someday someone would ask. His voice dropped. And today, you asked. A murmur rippled through the gallery. One of the jurors blinked rapidly. Another sat back in their chair like the weight of what was said had finally sunk in. Chris leaned forward. He ruined lives, not just mine. I'm just the one who survived long enough to say it out loud. The judge's gavel didn't move, because control no longer belonged to the courtroom. It belonged to the truth. I was 21 when it got serious, when I realized I wasn't free. My career wasn't mine. My choices weren't mine. Every move I made, I felt watched. He took a moment, then added, because I was. And the lights above flickered for just a second. Chris didn't notice, or maybe he did and kept going anyway. You think this is about drama? Fame? No. This is about the system that hides behind it. The culture of silence, of grooming, of ownership. His fingers pressed hard into the wood. There was a night I helped someone, another artist, a girl, 21, bright, pure voice. She thought she was invited to collaborate. Instead, she left broken. And when I asked too many questions, I got the warning. His voice dropped. Back off. This ain't your fight. He shook his head. But it always was, and I wasn't going to die with it stuck in my throat. He pulled something from his coat, a small notebook, worn, bent at the corners. He placed it gently on the witness stand. This is every note I wrote, every time I felt trapped, every time I didn't speak when I should have. He stared out into the courtroom. Today I speak, not just for me, but for every name too scared to walk through that door. He turned toward Diddy. You broke something in me, and I let you, because I didn't know I had a choice, but now I do. The bailiff moved slightly. The judge leaned forward. But the moment didn't belong to them. It belonged to Chris, to the boy who had been molded into a product, and to the man who had clawed his way back into personhood. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply stood in truth. And the courtroom wasn't listening anymore. It was witnessing. The judge finally spoke, but even his voice sounded smaller somehow, as though the air in the room still belonged to Chris. Mr. Brown, the court recognizes your testimony under emergency motion. The prosecution may proceed with formal questioning following recess. But the prosecution didn't speak, not yet, because the room, the world, was still digesting what had just happened. Chris remained standing, one hand resting on the notebook, the other clenched at his side, not from anger, but resolve. The silence stretched again, thick like velvet, then peeled away slowly as murmurs rose in the gallery. Reporters weren't scribbling, they were frozen. Jurors stared at him not as a celebrity, but as someone entirely transformed. Someone who had chosen to burn every bridge behind him so no retreat was possible. A man who had once been a headline was now the headline. The judge declared a recess, but Chris didn't move. He sat down slowly, as if lowering himself into a storm he no longer feared. Lawyers filed out. Spectators whispered. But Chris? He simply sat there, steady, letting the weight of his words settle over the empty chair across from him, the one that belonged to the man who made him. Diddy Combe. The defense table didn't move for a few seconds. Then Diddy Combe rose, adjusted the cuffs of his designer blazer, and walked out behind his legal team, unshaken on the outside, but the shift in his energy wasn't missed. The mask was intact, but the edges cracked. A single glance from him, sharp, calculating, furious, met Chris's across the room. Chris didn't blink. That silence between them was louder than any outburst could ever be. The kind of silence you don't recover from. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed like a shaken hive. Reporters were already calling their producers. Social media was on fire. Chris Brown testifies against Diddy Combe had already started trending before he stood up from the witness stand. But none of that noise made it inside Chris's head. Not anymore. Not after what he had just given up to be there. Truth was a sacrifice. And he had finally offered it. During the break, an older court security officer walked past Chris and, without saying a word, gently tapped the notebook sitting on the stand and nodded. Respect, silent and human. It was the first acknowledgement Chris received not as a star, not as a witness, but as a man. The bailiff returned, signaling 5 minutes left before court resumed. Chris stood and walked to the window just outside the courtroom. For the first time in a long time, he breathed like it belonged to him. He stared out at the crowd gathered beyond the courthouse steps. Some carried signs. Some wore shirts with his name. But others he knew stood there because something in his words had unlocked their own silence. Somewhere in the sea of faces were survivors, witnesses of their own, and now they had a voice to point to and say, "Me too." The prosecution approached him quietly. "Chris," the lead attorney said, "you don't have to go back up. What you said, it changed the entire tone of this trial." Chris shook his head. "I'm not done." The attorney hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. But from here on out, everything becomes part of the official record. No edits, no filters. You ready for that?" Chris looked back toward the courtroom doors. "I've been ready. I just didn't know I was allowed." They re-entered. The gallery filled again. Cameras weren't allowed in the room, but the silence said more than any lens ever could. Everyone sensed it, the second half of a story that no one was prepared for. When Chris retook the stand, he didn't start with another dramatic pause. He picked up exactly where he left off. "There's a moment I want to talk about. One I never told anyone about. Not my label, not my therapist, not even my mother." His voice was lower now, raw. "It was New Year's Eve, 2015, somewhere in the hills, I was at another one of those gatherings. This one wasn't big. It was curated. The courtroom leaned in. He pulled me aside. No one else heard him. He said, "Don't forget who gave you your name." Chris paused. He said it like a joke, but it wasn't. It was a warning, and I felt it in my bones. A juror visibly swallowed. I went back to my hotel room that night and cried. Not because I was sad, because I realized I wasn't free. My voice, my image, my future, they weren't mine. They were favors, loans he expected to collect with interest. He adjusted the mic. So I started documenting everything. Every retreat, every party, every phone call that felt too convenient. I started building a map, not just of what happened to me, but of how this system works. The handlers, the influencers, the people who make the threats sound like lullabies. He reached into the folder in front of him again. "And this," he said as he pulled out several printed messages, "is what that looks like." The bailiff walked over and collected the stack, passing them to the judge, then the prosecution. The courtroom held its collective breath. "The thing about trauma," Chris said, "is that it rewires you. You stop trusting praise. You stop recognizing kindness, because you've learned that everything good can be weaponized against you." He looked toward the prosecution bench. "You want to understand the hold he had on people? These messages came after I tried to distance myself, after I skipped one retreat, after I said no to a collab." The prosecution read aloud one. "You're still family, but let's not forget who kept the wolves off you when it mattered." Another. "We cleaned up that last mess. You remember how grateful you were? Let's not flip the script now." And a third. "If you're feeling like talking out of turn, remember we all signed the same silence." The courtroom was still. Even the defense team now wore tight-lipped panic beneath their poker faces. Chris's eyes drifted from face to face, pausing at each juror. "I'm not saying I was innocent. I'm saying I was targeted, molded, controlled. And I'm here now to break that chain, not just for me, but for every artist still caught in it." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Brown, do you wish to submit those messages into evidence?" Chris nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. And this?" He held up the notebook. "The full record. 10 years' worth of fear written in ink." The gavel came down. "So entered." And just like that, the record changed. The trial changed. Maybe even the industry changed. Chris sat back, not with arrogance, not with victory, but with the quiet strength of a man who just cracked open the gates of an empire that no one had dared touch. And as the courtroom braced for what the prosecution would do next, everyone knew one thing for certain: this wasn't about one man anymore. It was about all of them. The silent, the forgotten, the erased. And their story was only just beginning. When court resumed after a brief recess, the lights above the jury box seemed dimmer. Or maybe it was just the weight of what had been said that made everything else look a little darker. Chris remained seated at the witness stand, posture steady, hands clasped in front of him not to control his nerves, but to anchor himself. Because what came next wasn't just for the record. It was for every person who had been made to believe their pain was a transaction, not a violation. The prosecution returned to their place, but their demeanor had shifted. No longer clinical or calculated, they now carried the air of quiet reverence. This was no longer about winning a case. This was about witnessing something none of them would ever be able to unhear. The lead prosecutor stepped forward. "Mr. Brown," he began gently, You mentioned earlier that there were other individuals, people who may not be in this courtroom, but who were part of this system. Can you elaborate?" Chris took a breath. "There was a girl," he said. "I never knew her real name. We met at one of those so-called spiritual retreats in the desert. No phones, no outside contact, just a house, a team of handlers, and Diddy." His voice didn't shake, but his jaw tensed. "She couldn't have been more than 20. She said she was flown in for an opportunity. They told her she'd be introduced to producers, given space to record. But when we got there, she wasn't allowed to leave her room for 3 days. And when she finally came out, she was quiet, like broken quiet." He stared at the floor for a long second. "I saw her sitting on the edge of the pool, not even dressed for the water, just staring at it like she was trying to disappear into it. I asked her if she was okay. She looked at me and said, 'I'm not here to be okay. I'm here to be chosen.'" He looked back up. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't do anything. And then a week later, she was gone. Her social media deleted. Her music disappeared. She was erased." A low gasp rippled through the gallery. The defense didn't move. Couldn't. The court stenographer's hands trembled slightly as she typed. The rhythm, no longer just mechanical, it was human. Chris leaned forward again. "That's how it works. If you don't play the part, if you ask too many questions, if you try to pull someone out, you vanish. Or worse, you stay and become like him." The prosecutor cleared his throat, visibly emotional. "Mr. Brown, you also mentioned earlier that you began documenting your experiences. Can you clarify when that began?" Chris nodded. "The night of that New Year's Eve party in 2015. That was the first time I felt disposable, like everything I'd built could be taken from me in a single breath. So I wrote it down, every time he called after a scandal, every time someone from his team messaged me with a reminder of what I owed, every time a deal mysteriously fell apart after I said no to an invite." He lifted the notebook again. "This became my memory. Because the more I stayed in that system, the more I started forgetting who I was. This kept me human." He placed the notebook gently on the edge of the stand, like one would place flowers on a grave. The judge stared at it for a long time. The jury watched his hands like they were sacred. Then the prosecutor asked, "Can you tell the court what you wrote in the entry dated June 7th, 2019? Chris closed his eyes for a moment. Then, without looking down, he recited it from memory. "June 7th, 2019. He called me again. Said he forgave me for speaking out in that interview. Said I was still family. But I could hear it under his voice, the control, the need to be needed. He told me, 'You can win Grammys, but you'll never own your career without me.' And for the first time, I didn't feel scared. I felt sad. Because I finally saw him for what he was. Not a mentor, not even a monster. Just a man terrified of losing the illusion that he created everything around him." And the courtroom didn't breathe. You could hear the fluorescent hum above them. One of the jurors wiped their eye with the back of their sleeve. The judge's pen, which had been clicking periodically through previous testimonies, sat still beside him. Chris opened his eyes. "I'm here because silence doesn't protect people. It just gives the abuser more time to build new rooms, new victims, new versions of the same machine." He turned slowly toward Diddycombe, who remained unmoved, but somehow smaller now. "And you're not just a man with power. You're a man who worships control, who disguises cages as contracts and calls it mentorship. The lead prosecutor turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the witness has clearly provided information that not only establishes a pattern of psychological and professional manipulation, but direct involvement in behavior that may require further investigation outside the scope of this current trial." The judge nodded slowly. "Duly noted." He turned to Chris. "Mr. Brown, do you wish to submit any further evidence into the record?" Chris reached into his folder and pulled out a printed page texts, emails, time-stamped calls. These were never meant to be seen, but if seeing them means someone else doesn't have to go through what I did, then yes, submit them all. He stood from the witness chair, not with dramatic flair, not like a man finishing a performance, but like someone walking away from a confessional, lighter only by a fraction, but free for the first time in years. As he stepped down, someone in the gallery began to clap, softly. Just one person, but then another, and another, until the whole room rose, not as an ovation, but as acknowledgement. Not because he was famous, but because he had survived. And because survival, when spoken aloud, is contagious. The judge called for a recess. Chris didn't linger. He nodded once to the jury, once to the judge, and once just barely to the prosecution. Then he walked toward the exit. No one stopped him. No one asked for a quote, because he had already said everything that needed to be said. And in the space he left behind, you could feel something shifting. Not just in that courtroom, but in an industry, in a culture, in a world that had for too long mistaken silence for consent. And far behind him, sitting alone at the defense table, was a man who used to command rooms with his presence. Now, the room had moved on without him. When Chris stepped into the hallway, the noise outside hit him like a wave camera's clicking, voices shouting, reporters jostling to get a line, a word, anything. But Chris didn't speak. Not yet. He moved through them like a ghost made real, eyes forward, every step deliberate. The air smelled like metal and sweat and urgency, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't smell like fear. He walked past the security checkpoint, past the marble columns, past the news vans lined up like soldiers, and emerged onto the steps of the courthouse where a growing crowd waited, phones raised, eyes wide, faces unsure if they were watching a man fall or rise. Chris stopped just shy of the top step. He turned slowly, not to pose, not to perform, but to look, to really see what had come from the silence he had finally broken. Behind him, the courtroom doors were still swinging closed. The echo of testimony still lingered in the glass. The prosecution team remained inside, regrouping, already preparing for what came next: cross-examination, follow-ups, perhaps new subpoenas. But none of that belonged to Chris now. His role in the courtroom was done. His role in the truth, however, had only just begun. A young woman at the edge of the crowd whispered, "That's him." And then silence again, the kind of hush that lives in reverence, not awe. She didn't shout his name. She didn't ask for a picture. She simply held her phone to her chest and looked at him the way survivors look at each other. Chris nodded to her, a small motion, but it carried weight, because both of them knew exactly what that nod meant. Inside the courtroom, the judge had resumed his seat. The next witness was being prepared, but something had shifted. The pace was slower, the tone more cautious. Even the defense looked unsettled, their once sharp legal strategy now having to bend under the pressure of public reckoning. They were no longer just defending a man. They were defending a myth, and the cracks in that myth were spreading. Diddy sat stone still, his hands clasped on the table in front of him, eyes low. Not because he was humble, but because looking up now meant facing something he hadn't prepared for. A truth he couldn't control. For years, his power had lived in whispers, in the uncertainty of those too scared to speak, in contracts signed under duress and loyalty bought with silence. But silence had turned against him, and once it did, it became something more dangerous than fame evidence. Back outside, Chris took a breath and turned away from the courthouse steps. The crowd parted instinctively, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. A car waited at the curb, not a limo, not blacked out, just a plain sedan with a single person behind the wheel, his mother. She stepped out when she saw him, eyes red but proud. She didn't ask him how it went. She already knew. She hugged him hard, the kind of hug that squeezes decades of pain into something livable. Then she opened the passenger door. As he slid inside, the door shut with a finality that sounded almost like peace. Inside the courtroom, the next witness was sworn in. But no one would forget what had happened before them. No one would forget the man who sat down and dismantled the illusion, one sentence at a time. The jury whispered among themselves as evidence was passed down the line. Printed screenshots, voicemails, personal journals, things the court had never expected but could no longer ignore. Every juror had that look, now the one that says this trial just changed shape. A junior member of the defense leaned toward lead counsel and whispered, "Should we prepare for redirect?" The lead counsel didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened the same way Diddy had when Chris first walked in. "We might not get that chance," he said quietly. At the far end of the gallery, a reporter for a major outlet texted her editor just 2 words. He flipped it. And she was right. This wasn't just about allegations anymore. It was about legacy. About the shadow behind every platinum plaque and every Grammy trophy. About the price of silence in an industry that rewards performance more than truth. As court adjourned for the day, one final image played on every news broadcast across the country. Chris, walking alone through the courthouse doors, a notebook in his hand, eyes steady. No entourage, no sunglasses, just a man walking away from a story he had finally reclaimed. That night, the evening news ran wall-to-wall coverage. Legal experts debated the implications. Victims' rights advocates called it a watershed moment. Celebrities posted vague captions that weren't vague at all. And on Twitter, a single phrase trended worldwide for 12 hours straight. "You don't own us anymore." Chris didn't go home that night. Not to his condo in L.A., not to any place with chandeliers or velvet ropes. He stayed at a quiet Airbnb outside the city. No staff, no assistants, just him, a notepad, and the sky. Because the fight wasn't over, but the silence was. And the empire? The empire had heard its first real crack, and it wouldn't be the last. The following morning dawned with an eerie kind of clarity. The sky above the city was pale and cloudless, almost sterile, as if nature itself had paused to watch what would happen next. Chris sat by the window of that small rental house, a chipped mug of coffee cooling in his hand, though he hadn't taken a sip. The television was off, his phone face down. For the first time in years, he didn't need to scroll through headlines to know he was at the center of all of them. He could feel it. Not the fame kind of feeling, no adrenaline, no vanity. Just the strange, echoing quiet that comes after a man stops running from his past and finally turns around to name it. Down the road, camera vans were already parked at the gates of the courthouse. Journalists looked exhausted, like even they hadn't expected the story to go this far, to pierce this deep. Overnight, Chris's testimony had been clipped, transcribed, dissected, and reposted. Celebrities had gone from subtle likes to full-throated support. Former colleagues he hadn't spoken to in years were now messaging him cryptic lines like, "I see you," and "'bout time." One even wrote, "You gave us a spine, bro. Thank you." Chris turned the phone off again. The truth wasn't over yet, and he wasn't interested in applause. What mattered now was what happened inside that courtroom today, because he knew that once he had opened that door, others would follow, or try. And Diddy Combs' team would do everything in their power to close it again. At 9:41 a.m., he stepped out of the house wearing the same plain black suit from the day before. No stylist, no press release, just purpose. The drive back to the courthouse felt slower, though it wasn't. He watched the city blur by billboards, storefronts, pedestrians on corners unaware they were walking past the unraveling of an empire. By the time he arrived, the mood outside the courthouse had transformed. Protesters had gathered. Not angry mobs, but survivors, artists, dancers, assistants. People with signs that didn't shout accusations but whispered pain. He said, "I was nothing without him. I believed the silence would protect me. I see you, Chris. No more rooms. You don't own me." Inside the courtroom, the temperature was different now. Tense, fragile. Everyone sat straighter. Even the judge, seasoned and practiced, looked like he'd slept with one eye open. Diddy Combs' team entered quietly. No chatter today, no smirks. Just strategy, thinly veiled panic disguised as professionalism. Then the doors opened, and Chris entered. No music, no fanfare, just silence, thick as oil. He took his seat in the gallery this time, not at the witness stand, not today. But the room still tilted when he walked in. The jurors noticed. Everyone did. The prosecution began their next move, calling corroborating witnesses, a former bodyguard, a music assistant, a hairstylist. One by one, they stepped forward not with the emotional weight of Chris's testimony, but with details that matched his story thread for thread. A voicemail here, a text chain there, a receipt, a flight record, an NDA dated the same week as one of Chris's retreats. Each puzzle piece slid into place. But it wasn't until a young woman unidentified, voice disguised for protection, took the stand that the courtroom stopped breathing again. "I was 19, she said, voice distorted. "I thought I was going to a writing session. My manager said it was a great opportunity. That's what they always say." Her hands trembled. She gripped the microphone. "But when I got there, it wasn't a studio. It was a house. Phones were taken. They told me it was for privacy, for safety." She hesitated. But what happened there had nothing to do with music, and everything to do with control. Chris didn't move, but he felt every word like it was being carved into the air. The woman continued, recounting rooms she wasn't allowed to leave, people she wasn't allowed to name, and a man who watched everything without ever needing to speak. "I didn't even know who Chris Brown was back then, but I remember hearing music in the house, his voice. It was playing from a speaker in the hallway, and I remember thinking, he's part of this. But now I know he was trapped too." A murmur swept the gallery. The defense objected. The judge overruled. And when the woman stepped down, her shadow stayed behind, hanging over Diddy Combs' legal team like a warning. The myth was no longer just breaking. It was bleeding. At recess, the prosecutor approached Chris again. "We've got more," he said quietly. "Old employees, runners, even a driver from 2012. It's like your words flipped a switch. They're lining up." Chris didn't smile. He simply said, "Then let's keep the lights on." By afternoon, court reconvened. Diddy Combs' team attempted damage control. They challenged timelines, questioned memory, floated theories of vengeance, jealousy, career rivalry. But it landed hollow, like men arguing with a rising tide. Then came the moment no one had expected. Diddy Combs stood, without warning, without prompting. He adjusted his tie, stepped forward, and whispered something to his lead counsel. The lead counsel's eyes widened. Then his lips pressed into a line. Then he nodded once, stiffly. Diddy Combs wanted to testify. The room shifted on its axis. The jury blinked as one. The judge leaned back. "Mr. Diddy Combs, are you requesting to take the stand?" A pause. "I am." The air went thinner than it had all trial, and in the gallery, Chris straightened not in anticipation, not in fear, but in readiness, because sometimes, when truth is finally spoken aloud, the lie tries to speak back. But it never sounds the same.